All right. Well, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Meg Fromm. I'm the education manager for NAMELY, the National Association for Media Literacy Education. And tonight we have an incredible panel to talk about the growing movements to censor books in schools. We picked this topic and have really prioritized bringing in such experts and people with incredible experiences advocating in this field, because as media literacy continues to be top of mind for people, one of the core principles of media literacy points us to how essential free communication and free discourse and access and lack of censorship is to a democracy. So when we think about the core principles of media literacy, today, on our second day of Media Literacy Week, analyze is our theme. We want everybody to be able to analyze media messages. And before we can do that, we need access. And so I think that's a great way to think about why this panel in particular is so important for us during Media Literacy Week. So as you can see on our screen, we have a wonderful lineup tonight. I'll introduce more of these folks as they join us on stage, but first I want to bring on Nadine Farid Johnson. She is PEN America's Washington director, and she's going to share a little bit about sort of the impetus for this session. PEN America did a report to really dive into what was happening with book banning and censorship in the 2021 school year, 2020 to 2021 school year. And the findings, I think, really illustrate where we are as a society and why we need to pay attention to this movement. So thank you for being with us, Nadine. I would love it if you would introduce yourself a little bit, and then we can talk about the report.
Great. Thank you so much, Meg. It's an honor to be here. My name is Nadine Farid Johnson, and I'm the Managing Director of PEN America Washington and Free Expression Programs. And over the past year and a half or so, PEN America has collected reports of rapidly increasing restrictions on books and the freedom to read and learn in classrooms. As an organization committed to defending free expression and open access to literature for the past 100 years, we're actually celebrating our centenary this year, we felt compelled to drill down on the problem nationwide and identify the larger trends, including which states are leading the charge, censor books, which topics, which voices, which identities are being erased and silenced, and just how widespread censorship has become in America. So we put out a couple of different reports. Our most recent report shows that in 138 school districts across 32 states, there was an issuance of more than 2,500 book bans just in the last school year alone. That number itself is pretty striking, but what's even more striking to me is that that's about 1,000 more book bans than the ones we uncovered when we released the first edition of our report just 5 months prior. So truly a remarkable increase in the number of book bans that we saw happening across the states. The numbers are, as I said, really striking. We had 2,532 instances of individual books being banned, which affected 1,648 unique book titles by 1,261 authors, 290 illustrators, and 18 translators. So you're talking about the literary, scholarly, and creative work of over 1,500 people altogether.
Thank you for that context. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen just so that folks can see and engage a little bit better. This report, as you so eloquently describe, really highlights the movement, which really has become such a problem, quite frankly. I mean, especially from an educational perspective as a teacher, I think about that and I think about what does another 5 months look like. So I appreciate you giving this context so that we can really understand what it is looking at or what it's looking like. That being said, this is not the first time that we have seen book banning as sort of a moment or a movement in the United States. We've had other flashpoints in US history where book banning gained traction, in the 80s with Jerry Falwell, for example. And so I'm wondering what makes this timing or this movement maybe different or perhaps even more dangerous than instances in the past.
You're correct. This is not the first time we've seen this in US history, of course. In the McCarthy era, for example, there was a movement that was mostly targeted toward textbooks. And as you mentioned, in the 80s, there was a separate type of movement. What's, I think, interesting about this moment is that this increasing pace of book bans is really a reflection of coordinated work by a constellation of organized groups. PEN America discovered that there are at least 50 national groups that are pushing for book bans all across the country, and collectively they claim affiliation with about 300 chapters nationwide at the local level. So what we're seeing here is really a concerted effort to implement and enforce censorious practices that are effectively allowing some parents and citizens to constrain the availability of books for all students in their school communities, which really does make it have a different flavor this time.
That when you say, coordinated groups, is this something where you're seeing sort of even shared tactics among how this is working in different communities?
We are seeing shared tactics. We've seen shared lists of books that would be sent via various means online and what have you. And we know that they're the same because we often will see the same information, often same typographical errors will go from list to list, so you know it's something that's being shared. And we're noticing more of a willingness to speak up and talk about this in various school board meetings or what have you, where people are really making themselves known and doing so in a way that, again, is really permeating. And the other part of it, in terms of the list, is that in these thousands of book bans that we've seen, our data shows that about 96% of these bans didn't undergo any kind of review process. There was nothing that was this established, considered, neutral process to review the material that was being challenged, make a determination, and act accordingly. It was essentially, here is a list, we've received this, we're going to diminish access to all these materials immediately.
Wow, I had no idea that that number was so high, just like no process whatsoever. Among the titles that you mentioned 1,648 unique titles being banned. And as I was looking through the report, I noticed that about 10% of those were because of themes related to rights and activism. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about this category and what that might look like.
Sure. I think it's important to also give an overview about what we found in terms of the books targeted broadly. Overwhelmingly, the books targeted for removal feature protagonists of color or highlight areas of race and racism, or they feature LGBTQ plus issues, identities, and protagonists. We found, as you note, 10% or so looking at rights and activism, about 4% included characters and stories that reflected religious minorities. So a lot of this looks to what types of voices are being silenced here, what kind of censorship is coming into play. And in terms of the activism and the rights, one thing that really struck me when reading this data was the number of biographies that have been banned. Books about Michelle Obama, books about Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, books about Malala Yousafzai. All these women who have and girls who have done trailblazing things their stories are being silenced. I also think it's really interesting to look at the authors who are being banned, because there are certainly household names. You have Art Spiegelman, you have Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, Eric Carle, who wrote a number of children's books, Todd Parr. But there are the vast majority of these authors are not well known. The vast majority of these authors, some of them, it could be their debut novel. After years of working toward a dream of being able to write the books they wanted to see in the world. And that poses another set of issues in terms of, again, who is being represented in these books? What are students being exposed to in terms of understanding and building empathy? And really, what are we trying to hide in terms of these bans?
It's so interesting to imagine that people who have become part of our, just our daily understanding of society and politics, like Michelle Obama, for example, to imagine that just their life story would be inaccessible to students. I think that is really troublesome. People typically think this is a really politically divided issue, but overall research pretty consistently shows that most Americans are against book bans. So in our prep call for this, you mentioned you called book banning a solution in search of a problem, which I thought was such an apt description. It really just stood out to me as like, what a perfect way to talk about what is happening. Why do you think these movements are gaining traction and attention right now? Why is this become a solution in search of a problem?
It's a really good question. In another event I did recently, I was asked if this current wave was a worrisome eruption of censorship, if it was a well-intentioned effort to protect children, or if it was just another skirmish in the culture wars that are consuming the American public and American politics. And I said, it's really all of those. I think that speaks to this idea about having this be a solution in search of a problem. When access to a book in a school library or classroom is removed or restricted, that's censorship. That is government interference in access to information. And as a free expression organization, we view that obviously as a considerable problem. But it's also something that right now this is being used as a divisive method. It's sometimes pitting parents against teachers or parents against librarians, when the truth is that parents and teachers and librarians all have an interest in focusing on nurturing and guiding the children in their care. And it should be something that is done in a way that is within a community and that is working toward solutions and collaboration, as opposed to this effort to divide and to otherize. And unfortunately, what we've seen in terms of the books that I shared with you, the numbers that we saw in terms of what types of books are being banned, this movement is quite clearly focused on removing content that is focused on certain issues: race, racism, LGBT plus identity, and that makes it fodder for politics.
And I think too, there are so many other issues happening in education right now that are top of mind for people and feel equally politically divisive. And I'm thinking about, things like educational gag orders, which in terms of what we're seeing process and how they're sort of the advocacy behind it and the activism behind it feels somewhat similar to book banning. And so I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of how book banning is intersecting with these other issues.
That's a critically important point, Meg, because this is not happening in a vacuum. It is part and parcel of a broader movement that is looking to censor and control what is happening in schools and public schools in particular. We have found with our educational gag order work, let me explain that these are bills that are designed to chill academic and educational discussions and impose government dictates on teaching and learning. They are imposing content and viewpoint-based censorship. And what we found is that they have a chilling effect on teachers, because it's seeking a ban on an intellectual framework, and that is inevitably leading to the policing of teachers and students' thoughts and ideas. So what we have found is that since January of last year, again, in terms of we are talking about the shared tactics that you asked about and the lists that are being shared, we've seen something similar in the educational gag order sphere, in which there are similar language being used in bills and similar impetus behind 191 state level bills in 41 states. Now, 17 of those are currently live. 19 laws have passed in 15 different states. And then 4 additional states have enacted some sort of executive order or another state policy. This is affecting 122 million Americans who live in these states. And in terms of the book bans, we have about 4 million students in the districts that are being affected. So this is something that is truly widespread. It is gaining momentum. And again, it's looking at a way of removing the access to information in the classroom, which is incredibly harmful to learning as well as to the teachers and librarians who are trying to educate students.
That's a perfect segue for us to bring on our other guests to really give perspective to this. We've got 2 other wonderful panelists who are going to join us. We've got Joe Colburn, who is an academic librarian and a doctoral student at the University of Missouri. He is also the chair of the Intellectual Freedom Committee at the Missouri Library Association. So Joe is going to join us here in a second. And Jamie Gregory is going to join us. She's an upper school librarian and journalism newspaper teacher at Christ Church Episcopal School in South Carolina. And so I think having, we've talked about the policies, we talked about the movement that we're seeing, and now let's frame this out with some real life perspectives of what's happening to librarians and to teachers in the classroom. So I'm going to start actually with Jamie, if we can start with you. I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about your background in your work in libraries.
Sure, and thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here joining you tonight. So this is my 18th year in education. I spent 8 years as a high school teacher, and this is my 10th year working as a high school librarian. I am the upper school librarian right now. That's grades 9 through 12, and I also teach the journalism newspaper elective. So that's a little bit of my background.
Thank you. We're so lucky to have such qualified people here tonight on this panel. I mean, you all have so much perspective to offer. You are, you buried the lead a little bit. You're a nationally award-winning librarian and teacher. So you're very well respected in your field. And you most recently were honored with the 2022 South Carolina School Librarian of the Year Award. But the censorship movement has kind of targeted you as an enemy of students, painted you as sometimes being unfit for making these decisions as a librarian. And this has been a really troublesome, almost personal attack. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what has happened in your experience.
Yeah, unfortunately I can. And so it definitely doesn't make sense when you think about it, because most people, when they tell you memories of their own school experience, have nothing but wonderful things to say about their own school librarians. And so nothing about this time period has been impersonal. I'm sure anyone who's paid attention to the news has probably seen a glimpse of this. School librarians across the country, we've been called pedophiles. We have been accused of distributing and making available obscene content to our students, pornographic materials, and otherwise inappropriate materials. And I don't think people take the time to understand that those are very serious charges, and they are not labels to throw around lightly, especially when all you're trying to do is maybe express that you are unsettled by some reading material that's available. And it's not just about that. We're also being accused of indoctrinating students in terms of critical race theory, teaching white students to feel badly about themselves, dividing people, and those sorts of accusations. A lot of the accusations have centered on books about racism, like Stamped by Jason Reynolds, and books, of course, with LGBTQIA+ issues. Even having displays with these books has come under fire. And often this happens, again, very personally, by having people call our schools to complain about us. They might call the superintendent, they might call the school board members to complain about us. They do smear campaigns on social media. Well, they'll just say so-and-so works at this school and she's distributing pornography to her students. They even will doctor social media posts before we have to make our accounts private. And that happened to me. There are 2 state representatives who engaged in that sort of smear campaign against me. And they took a tweet that before my account was private, where I had expressed support for the book Genderqueer, and made it look like I had posted pictures of that from the actual graphic novel, depicting some what they called inappropriate pornographic scenes. So all of those are very scary. I've had people call my school about me, but I have a very supportive administrative team here. I'm in a very supportive school, but obviously this is very unsettling. And people may have seen the news where our National School Librarian of the Year, Amanda Jones, she sued the group who did all of these actions against her. And while she did initially lose, she is appealing that decision. So yeah, everything has been really, really personal. And so it is interesting during Media Literacy Week also to talk about how people are taking our social media posts and doctoring them.
Right. We have this context of what's happening in the classrooms, and then we also have the messaging around that, which is, it's a media literacy lesson in and of itself, and more lessons than we could possibly deal with in any given day. I thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of us, some of us in this room know your story, and I can't imagine reliving that is necessarily the easiest thing to do. But what strikes me is, how eloquently you speak about what this looks like, what our role is for students. As a librarian and as a teacher, you have a lot of experience in the classroom. And I know in my own time dealing with this issue, I hear a lot of misconceptions about what communities or what parents think actually happens in a library, and how content is chosen, or if there even is a process, right? Some people might imagine that there's no process whatsoever. So would you speak to some of the common misconceptions that happen in regards to content that's available in schools, and maybe even some of the processes that are actually already in place to make sure that content is appropriate for students?
Absolutely. I really appreciate this question because a lot of us school librarians, when we get together, we talk about this. There absolutely are procedures in place for book selection, materials, and acquisitions. Absolutely. And what that leads to is me saying, being a librarian is a profession. We are professionals. It's not a hobby. It's not something that we just do on the side because we love books. We are trained professionals. And if you're a school librarian, that often means that you have to also be a certified teacher in your state. That's true in South Carolina, where I am. Most of us have a master's degree in library and information science. A lot of us have national board certification for teaching in library media. So we are well trained in how to select books that are appropriate for whatever audience we're serving or who our patrons are, and also in how to respect other people's viewpoints. And that another misconception that actually just came up where I live in Greenville, South Carolina, our public library board, the chairman of the board said that he basically didn't support LGBTQ plus book displays because that was an example of a library endorsing that viewpoint or that lifestyle. And that is absolutely not true. That's one of the first things that you learn when you start your master's in library science degree, is that whatever materials are made available in your library, the library itself, it does not endorse everything that you can find in your library. And so that's a very common misconception. And I mean, I understand that not everybody is going to know all of the basics of our profession, but that's why we want to have the opportunity to explain to people. And I think another point that's very important to make that a lot of the people who want to censor materials are missing is the idea that just because a student hears an idea or isn't exposed to an idea, that doesn't mean that they're having to adopt it as their own. That's just the point of education. They're just learning. And so, especially school librarians as trained teaching professionals, we know how to teach certain skills and concepts without telling a student how to personally believe about the topic.
That is such important information. I wish that we could somehow shout that from the rooftop, right? About in any classroom anywhere, right? Exposure to an idea doesn't mean we have to adopt it. And that's true outside of education too. And that's a really beautiful thing that maybe we've lost sight of, just in terms of what learning looks like in all of these different spaces. I'd like to sort of bring Joe into the conversation here. Joe is, as I mentioned, an academic librarian and doctoral student. He's chair of the Intellectual Freedom Committee of the Missouri Library Association. That's a mouthful. And I'm wondering if you can talk, what are people doing? Like, what do we do with this? How are groups like the committee working to mitigate some of these misconceptions, to inform people? Just how are we dealing with this?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question. And I'm also, I got to say, honored to be here with Jamie and Nadine. So thanks for having me. So our committee specifically, Missouri is a little bit complicated because, first of all, it's an at-will employment state. So a lot of folks like Jamie in Missouri they're suffering the same sort of slings and arrows from the press, from parents groups. And so a lot of folks are afraid to speak out. So what our committee has been trying to do is give sort of an ideological backboard for people when they want to speak up. So we've been issuing a lot of press releases, letters to specific school districts, and then we'll also kind of, CC all the local newspapers and press on that, just to give people a sense of here's what your local organization, this is our stance. So that's what we've really been trying to provide to people. We've been building coalitions behind the scenes with like the Missouri ACLU, with Every Library, with these other sort of organizations, with MASL, which is the Missouri Association of School Librarians. So we're trying to just kind of build those coalitions and find a grassroots way to sort of push back against some of these, I don't know, what I might actually call like AstroTurf parents group organizations, trying to foist, I don't know, like minority viewpoints on the majority of libraries and students and kind of what people have access to.
I love that you use the term astroturfing. It is such an important media literacy comment. And I actually just taught my students about that today. So if anybody is joining us and wants to have a little media literacy moment, Joe, do you want to like just kind of clarify what you mean by that term? These astroturfing campaigns are such an interesting component to what is happening.
Sure. I mean, I think of it as kind of the opposite of grassroots. So with grassroots, you have local people, stakeholders in a community organizing for advocacy, and then sort of building up from the local level. AstroTurf would be where you have like a national organization trying to produce local change by kind of installing these local groups that may not have been there before, or by tapping local groups and kind of giving them their platform, sort of like what Nadine was saying, where you see the same books being challenged, you see the same typos popping up across different states. Yeah,
absolutely. And I would even add to that, some of what I'm seeing with educational gag orders and book banning, and Nadine, maybe you've seen this as well. Part of the astroturfing element for some of these campaigns is you don't even know that they're not these national organizations. They really do a good job of kind of hiding behind shells that look like community instigated sort of moments. So thank you for bringing that up. That's like a really important, I think, component for this. I'm going to go off script just slightly. Sorry, Joe, because you said something that I thought is really important. You know, you mentioned, for example, doing press releases or trying to talk to journalists, and getting information out to people and getting the right information is so important. As Jamie mentioned, how do we deal with misconceptions and teach people what's really happening? How has that work been in trying to work with professional news media like journalists to clarify misconceptions? And has that been a successful way to do it? Is it something that seems to be gaining traction? I'm just curious how that has been working for your group.
Yeah, well, I had the advantage of, as part of my doctoral work, I got to work with Dr. Amanda Hinnant at Mizzou, and I taken some media sociology classes with her, and she showed us this idea called the hierarchy of influences model, which is just like a structure for how media works. It's a theory about that. And so just kind of using some of that and some of my experience as an activist, I think just realizing that if you cultivate these relationships with journalists, you know, on kind of a one-to-one basis, you're not trying to, you know, deceive them. You're trying to give them good information. You're trying to help them inform people in kind of an honest and straightforward way. I think a lot of journalists will really appreciate that, and they'll come back to you if they, you know, over time realize that you are giving them accurate information, and you're also kind of doing it in sort of a, if you kind of have like a weird writing style like I do, that helps, because then you have like a certain voice, I think, that people respond to. But it's been really good. We're having really a lot of success talking to journalists in Kansas City and St. Louis, and those are kind of on the either side of Missouri, and in Columbia. But we're kind of getting some of the sort of rural independent newspapers like the hinterlands we're having a little bit of trouble with still, I would say.
Thank you for sharing that. You know, we might have folks here listening tonight who are trying to figure out strategies and tactics in their own communities. And so when you mentioned journalists, I thought that was a great opportunity to know like what's working. And, you know, on that note, I would say for our audience here, feel free to type questions into the chat, to raise your hand. We have disabled the microphones just to make sure there isn't any errant audio, but we welcome your questions at any point. We do have some time set aside at the end for Q&A, but you're welcome to ask at any time. So good point to mention that. You just mentioned a couple communities where you're trying to, you know, sort of move the needle, so to speak, but there's even more happening in Missouri. There's a proposed bill related to this issue. What's going on with that?
Oh man, it's awful. So there's two things. There's SB 775, which is a bill that was supposed to be to protect children from sex trafficking, that a particular Kansas City area local, like state legislator added a part to that that would make it a misdemeanor for a teacher, a librarian, or other educational professional to help students find, and let me get the exact, I have this right here, I want to make sure I don't say this, explicit sexual material, which would include any pictorial, three-dimensional or visual depiction of all of these different, in any sort of visual medium. And it's defined kind of broadly. So basically what it ends up being is if a school librarian shows a kid a graphic novel that has nudity in it, that could qualify. So there's that. And then if that person is reported, they can be charged with a Class A misdemeanor, which could be up to a year in prison and several $1,000 fine. So there's that. And then additionally, there is a new proposed rule that is, it's 15 CSR 300 200.15 is what it is. It's like a proposed rule that is being open to comment on November 15th in Missouri. That's basically structuring the way that school librarians can set up their collection development policies, and they have to sort of sign off on this particular structure in order to receive state funding. And within that structure is included all of these limitations on what can be, there's the prurient interest quote in there. And it's basically like trying to make it so they can't have materials for LGBT students. I mean, any of the sort of things that Nadine and Jamie were both talking about in their library, or they won't be able to receive state funding. And it actually also includes programming. So it's a big overreach on the part of the Secretary of State, who's trying, because he's running for governor. That's why it's there. But these are both things that are going on right now. And we're talking with the ACLU right now. And I would say within the next 2 or 3 weeks, I would stay tuned to Missouri, because we may have something to announce legally. I'll just leave it at that.
A cliffhanger. It's a media literacy tactic to know too. I mean, aside from book burning, or book banning, which I guess in my mind feels a little bit like book burning. We are like just covering the gamut of media literacy habits and skills tonight. Nadine, let's bring you back into this conversation too, because, Joe mentioned journalists having relationships as a way to help people understand, to clarify what's happening. As advocacy groups are continuing to try to work against these bans, are there any successful case studies, anything we should look to for inspiration or trends or actions to guide our way as we challenge some of these bans?
Well, I think the first thing to do is educate people. So events like this are so critical to getting the word out, and you have a broad audience, people who respect your organization, and they're coming in to listen and to learn. That's absolutely critical. So I would say getting people educated about what's actually happening, having an understanding about what truly is occurring, and not listening to some of the misinformation that's out there about what books are in schools, the roles of teachers, the roles of librarians, as Jamie and Joe were talking about. I think all of that's really critical. We have seen situations in which students have led protests and other efforts to unban books. We saw in Pennsylvania that students led protests to return over 400 books to the shelves from a ban list. In Kansas, students at a board meeting managed to convince the board to unban the books they had started to ban. In Utah, there actually was national pressure to get a school board to back off from banning books. Other issues we've seen, places we've seen banned authors that were actually mobilizing, holding local events and giving out free copies just to draw attention to what's happening. Because as we noted earlier, it's not happening in a bubble. It's 32 different states. It's happening all across the country. It's happening oftentimes in conjunction with these educational gag orders that are also popping up all across the country. And it's a moment now where we really need to recognize what is happening vis-a-vis students, what's happening vis-a-vis teachers, librarians, and to recognize that this is something that we need to be aware of, and we need to report, and we need to be able to push back because of the really, to just incredibly detrimental effect it's going to have on our students and our schools.
And having this data from your report, I think is going to be so helpful in terms of just quantifying and like having a scope for how bad this is getting and where it's happening. I think it, it's not something where we want just anecdotal data. Like we really want to understand what's happening here. Joe, you talked a little bit about, journalists and some of your tactics. And then Jamie, I'm just curious, in your community and with your work, have there been any sort of success stories or any ways that you feel like you've been able to communicate or advocate or kind of move the needle with this issue?
Sure, there's several things. We have a very strong state association of school librarians, the South Carolina Association of School Librarians, and our current president, Tamara Cox, is a fabulous leader. She regularly sends letters on behalf of our organization to districts who restrict access to learning materials. And frequently we only learn about these censorship attempts if someone from the district reaches out to us. And often they need to remain anonymous because they fear losing their jobs. And very often it's a superintendent or a board member who just kind of gives a directive, pull these books out right now. So that it would be impossible to track if someone were not brave enough to, ask us to help. And I did last year connect with a local reporter from the Greenville News, who I noticed was covering this topic in the Greenville community. And I noticed that she, in one particular article, had not included any interviews from school librarians. And so I contacted her and just to say, hey, I love the article. I love that you're covering this. Could you include our voice next time? And that was a great conversation because I actually ended up being able to invite her into my journalism class so they could meet a reporter. And, they were interested in this topic anyway, as teenagers, something that affects them. And I actually learned that I think she had tried to, but no one wanted to go on record. So you have this interesting mix of people, librarians, we are the foundation of democracy. We go hand in hand with journalism. And I love that combination. But, you have a practical side of your life that, you don't want to lose your job. You don't want to put yourself in harm's way. You don't want to be the target of attacks. But then reaching out to that reporter myself made a difference. And then I was willing to give her a statement because, again, it links back to what I previously said of people not being aware of our profession and how we're trained and our ethics and that all of those things. So just being able to do, like Joe was talking about, the grassroots activities of banding together and being willing to stand up and say, no, the law is not on your side on this.
And I love that you mentioned students, and Nadine, you mentioned students fighting against these as well. This is a story and an issue that impacts them most of all. And, I think a tactic that we just couldn't do enough of is like getting students' voices heard. And that idea of representation in media literacy, that, if we're going to talk about something, we need to have all voices, and we need to have these people who are directly impacted have the ability to speak for themselves. And then people can see it's also not teachers speaking for them, or it's not indoctrination and some of those things. So I love that, making sure that we get students into this as well. I have more questions, selfishly, but I want to pause and take a minute and see if our audience has questions or comments or things you'd like to specifically talk about. Again, you can put them in the chat, is the easiest way to do that. So I'll just pause for just a moment. Panelists, you can grab a sip of water if you'd like, and we'll see who has some questions. And then if not, I will greedily ask all of the questions I have of these wonderful people. Okay, I see a question coming actually from backstage. So folks might not see it in the chat. I promise I am not making it up. I'm being fully transparent. It's coming from backstage. But I think this is an interesting question, and I'll just leave it open for anybody to answer here. What are your thoughts on how this will progress in the coming weeks months or years. Joe, you mentioned, elections. Is this purely an election term issue? Is it part of what we might be seeing a larger historical cycle? And they mentioned that book banning, in the digital age, these bans seem to be spreading more quickly than in other cycles. So maybe a little bit of just kind of, it might feel like conjecture, or just kind of hypothesizing, like, where do we think this will go in the coming weeks, months, or years? Which is a big question.
Yeah, that is a big question. I guess I would say that I think the election is kind of a test case. I don't think it's going to like magically go away after the election, but I think the role of people, grassroots, like with integrity, advocating for librarians, is to make this politically non-expedient as an issue for people who are trying to ban books. Because I think the only way it's going to go away is if we can show them this is not where you're going to find your votes. This is not going to be helpful to you. Because I think a lot of folks, just having worked with some people in the Missouri legislature, I think a lot of these folks don't even necessarily have like strongly held convictions about these things. They just see it as like a politically expedient thing to latch onto. So we need to disabuse them of that notion, I think.
I very much agree. I'm not always convinced that all of the politicians believe what they are repeating, but there are certainly citizens and communities that believe it, which is also very disappointing that seems believable to them about people working in the education profession and the librarian profession. We have an event in our state for school librarians called Hill Day, where we can go to our state capitol in Columbia and meet with our legislators to promote our profession and just have establish a link with them. And I talked to my local representative and just told him, we had a bill last term that was up, a censorship bill. And I just told him, come to our classrooms, see what we're doing. And he seemed kind of surprised when I told him what media literacy really was. It wasn't media, the term that they're misusing. And there's so many misconceptions about news literacy. And so when I told him what we do as librarians and what I do in my classroom, there is always that element of surprise. So even being able to talk to your politicians, invite them into your libraries, invite them into your classrooms. The rhetoric where I am is very strong. And I think it's going to take a lot of students and parents making their voices heard to really, on the local level, like Joe is saying, I think that's really what it's going to take.
I think if our data sets are any indication, this will continue to grow at least for some time. As I mentioned, our first report was evaluating what happened from July of 2021 through March of 2022. And then just from March to June of this year, there were an additional 1,000 bans. So we are in a moment now that I think is going to continue to increase. I think the points that Joe and Jay made are critically important, particularly about the fact that so much of this is connected in terms of people understanding what they're reading, understanding terms and phrases like media literacy, and being able to bring that knowledge to bear in a way, particularly in public service, in a way that is beneficial for the community. I think the other thing here, because this spreads so quickly and so fervently, and because these decisions are made, as Jamie has noted, in such quick succession. You have a list, it's banned, and unless someone reports it, it doesn't really come to light, because it's put under the umbrella of this is harmful, it's harming students, as opposed to really understanding what the content is, why it's being offered, under whose guidance, the professionals that are trained in this. The other part of this is that so much of this the rhetoric is about parental involvement, but the policies being proposed are not actually advancing parental involvement in their children's education. What they're doing is allowing a tiny minority of people to control other people's children. And that's really what's occurring. And that's where the heavy hand of censorship in terms of reacting to this is incredibly troublesome as a result.
I think one thing that has always come to mind, thinking about that transparency of like, this is what's happening in schools, like getting parents actually involved, helping people understand you really are just having sort of a small pocket of people determining things for everybody. I'm wondering, Jamie or Joe, if you could walk us through, like, say, like, let's help people visualize what actually happens, right? So like a student might be in a library, let's say, a sixth grader, and they pick up a book that might be mature for them. How do librarians respond to this? Like, what are some of the built-in ways that librarians help kids to pick books that are appropriate, to mitigate maybe discomfort around topics? Maybe if you want to talk a little bit about just what does it look like for a kid to engage with material and for librarians to be a resource in supporting the healthy interaction that happens there. I know that's a big
Jamie.
Well, there's several things that happen. I mean, first of all, if it's a patron that you've seen before or a student, you do naturally establish relationships. And so I love doing that, of course, because it's special in the library, even from being a classroom teacher. So they know that I'm not trying to harm them, that I just really love books and I want them to really love books, and tell me what you want and we'll go find things and all that fun stuff. And I am not their parent. I am not here to teach them their moral code that they should follow in their life. My moral code is not going to be their moral code, and I'm not involved in that process at all, which is something that you learn when you're getting your library degree. And so, I when a student wants to check out, they check out. I have no barriers, and that's part of our the ALA Code of Ethics. So that student gets that instruction at home. So if a student brings material home that the parent is not comfortable with, then that's the conversation they need to have. Return the book, and the student can tell me, I want to read this type of book instead, or whatever. That's a very healthy interaction. And it removes me from the morality equation that I should not be part of. And then of course I've had over the years, questions and concerns, and I take them very seriously. I'm a parent as well. And, you can approach that, assuming positive intent and just saying, okay, what are you concerned about? And the conversation goes from there. And even when I think it's becoming common now for districts to create guidelines where parents can opt out and tell us all the books, all the titles your kid can't check out. That is so unrealistic in our profession. I don't know how anyone will check anything out if when a kid brings a book to me, I have to consult a huge list or something like that. I should not be involved in that as the librarian.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think just beyond, so like Jamie's working in a school library setting, in a college or university library, it's even more expansive in terms of institutionally, we don't really want to have anything to say about morally or ethically what people are reading. We're just here to provide access to people. And, if you think about like a university, especially if someone's doing research, we can't be involved in going through the art collection and trying to figure out what is pornography or something like that. That's totally undermines the whole purpose of an academic library. I think there's also, we've talked about challenges and the way that process works. So like, even if a parent comes in and they say that, like, they don't want a particular book to be in the library, most libraries, like Jamie said, have a process for challenging that. Usually it'll go to a committee, eventually it'll go to a board. But what we're seeing now is parents and parent groups circumventing that entire process and just going straight to someone they know on the board, or someone who is like their particular representative or something like that. And that really undermines the library as an institution as well.
Thank you for painting those two pictures, because I think it speaks to understanding the purposes of higher education versus, K through 12, and also helping people understand the ways in which educators are trying to respect parent boundaries by not being the parent, by not choosing for children, by not trying to impose our own sense of morality and letting those conversations be had at home, with a parent. I do see some comments in the chat here, some questions. One from Wendy about if you've had the experience of books go missing. And so I think she's speaking here of like, she's missing 95% of her LGBTQ collection, and it's not, LGBTQ kids who are taking it. And so if you've had any experience with that.
I have not personally, but I do know of a librarian who has a group of people who they do come into her library. They try to catch her with certain materials and have all kinds of discussions and disagreements and arguments. At some point you have to get some administrators involved because especially the question, that's just stealing. And so you can absolutely, if you have the evidence and for sure it's the person, of course, you can absolutely have a conversation about, you're stealing library materials. So we have to either you pay for the materials, which is in my policy. If you don't return it, you pay for it. Because that's also a censorship strategy. Just check the books out and don't return them. Just to have some conversations and don't be alone when you have them.
Yeah, we had someone steal McGilligott's Pool, which is one of the Seuss 6 that the estate of Dr. Seuss decided to not publish because it has like racist imagery in it. And we assume that's because they're trying to sell it on eBay, but we have no proof of that. But it does occasionally happen. And like there's that type of censorship. And then there's also like where school administrators in Missouri are coming in and just taking books off the shelf, for example. Like during the summer when the school librarian is not even there, just specifically for that SB 775 in Missouri I was talking about, because they're trying to like protect their school librarians from prosecution, when really it might be kind of that they're trying to protect themselves from having to deal with these parent groups.
Wow. That is interesting to imagine all of the strategies to just get books off the shelves, not just keeping them from getting on the shelf in the first place. The idea that they would go missing is actually one I hadn't thought about. So Wendy, thank you for that question. I see another question here about, which speaks to sort of what we were talking about before. And I think we'll have time for just this one question, although it's a very complicated question. What if parents are not aware of, books their kids are borrowing? And I don't want to assume, so I think it's Padita, hopefully I said that correctly. I don't know if you have any clarifying comments with that. But there is a discomfort there, right? And I think some parents are coming at this from a discomfort of, I don't know if my kids are making good choices, let's say good choices in their mind, and not knowing about that and turning to schools as a way to mitigate that. And so I don't know if the three of you have any thoughts on this, on, that discomfort, or perhaps how we handle helping parents navigating kids maturing, making choices on their own, and things like that.
Yeah, I would just say, I don't think education is about being comfortable. I think you should have to, like, kids are going to encounter these ideas. What's always baffling to me is, people will talk about there being pornography in libraries, but it's like, there's the internet, you guys. I don't get, I don't get why we're specifically, if it is a good faith argument. So I think part of that is just talk to your kids. This is not something that you should be hashing out institutionally. If you have a problem with what your kid is reading, ask them, and then you're building that relationship too.
Yes, it's again, it's really none of my business. So, you build those relationships with your children as you see fit in your own home. Again, I have my own children. If I became aware of something they were reading I didn't like, I would not ask their librarian anything. That has to do with the values I'm trying to teach my child. Because again, every day we live under the Constitution, we abide by the First Amendment. you can't tell other parents what their kids can read. So, you know, we all agree in our country and our profession that these books are not obscene. They are not pornographic. They are not racist. So if you want to feel that way, you need to do that in the privacy of your own home with your own student. That is just none of my business.
These are really big conversations, and I wish we had another hour, although I know some of you are probably ready for dinner or ready for the end of your day. I think the last thing I might point to Nadine and say, what's next for PEN America in continuing to document what is happening? Is there another report? Are you continually gathering data? Is there anything we should have on our radar to just keep top of mind?
Thank you. Well, we are continuing to take reports of what's happening and to keep tabs on the data. Whether we're another report right now, we don't have a timeline for that, but as we talked about, this is something that is continuing, and I think continues to need attention as a result. If I may, I want to come back to a point Jamie just made and we made earlier as well, in terms of librarians and journalists being so much of the foundation of our democracy. This really does come down to democratic ideals and adherence to the First Amendment. Joe has mentioned some of the concerns about the obscenity in some of these materials. The legal bar for obscenity is actually quite high, and to reach that bar, there's a specific test that was put out by the Supreme Court almost 50 years ago. So there is something that when someone uses that phrase to talk about something, saying something is obscene does not make it so. There's actually a legal test that's involved. I think we need to be cognizant of that in terms of what is actually happening here. And just as an overarching matter, limiting access to literature stifles the free exchange of ideas. And that's essential in public schools, essential in any school. And we will continue to monitor and to educate and to let people know what's happening in an effort to combat the censorship that's been happening.
Thank you for that. I think that's a great way to close and to think about these broader issues of really what this means for a democratic society as a whole. I cannot thank you enough, Nadine, Jamie, Joe. Thank you for this conversation. They are not easy. Audience, thank you for your thoughtful questions. These are very personal issues, and so I really appreciate that we could all talk about it in a constructive and respectful way. So thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us for Media Literacy Week. Have a good evening. We're going to sign off here. Thanks.